The following care guide is brought to you by a true expert with questions asked by me. If you like this care guide, go watch or listen to the full episode on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcast from. If you want to support the channel, please like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with anyone it may help. You can also support me on Patreon. And one last thing before we get to the care guide, if you like this hobby and you want it to stick around for a while, please go get yourself a membership to USARK in USARK, Florida. Why don't we get into a little care guide for the Halmaheras?
Sure.
You down? So
Yeah.
let's look at this kind of from the perspective that this is somebody's pet, right? So it's going to be on display out in the house. So no tubs, just kind of looking at it from a display pet perspective.
So what I will say to that, I've only, especially with wild caught animals, I mean, those things they're in tubs for a couple of years before they see a cage. Like, let's say, for instance, you could get your hands on a captive bred animal, you know, if someone's watching this in 7 years and they're actually available. You theoretically could. If for anyone who's getting a wild caught animal, I would strongly encourage you to start it off in a dark tub as far away from activity as possible and just let that thing settle in, let it eat. Because they have this very like far gone look in their eyes when they're freshly imported. And like a year and a half later, a switch will just flip and then they're a normal scrub python. But for a while, they look kind of dead. I mean, it kind of sounds dark, but like anyone who's worked with fresh wild caught Halmaheras knows exactly what I'm talking about. They have this like glazed over eye look to them. They could be eating and doing fine. They seem like they're not fully settled yet. I think you put that snake in a cage and it dies in short order.
All right, so let me retract that. Eventually in a cage. So we'll kind of get to the eventual caging needs and all that, because I totally understand all that. Like I said, I have my Timors. The two younger ones are in tubs, just because their food response is exponential in that scenario.
So the primary thing is to set them up accordingly to where you live. You know, you doing it and me doing it is entirely different. I'm in the desert and you're in Florida. You would need an enclosure with a decent amount of ventilation. Scrub pythons do not do well in stagnant moisture. Their skin is kind of sensitive and very prone to blistering. Like, for instance, if you have a scrub python in a rack in a tub with water and paper, you go on vacation for a week. The night you leave, it knocks over that water bowl. It's in a lower tub in the rack, so it's kind of cold now. You come back and now that snake has blisters all over it. Wow. Where like a ball python or a carpet python, you wouldn't have that concern. You need to adjust your setup to where you'll get spikes in humidity for sure, because they're a tropical species, but where the physical moisture itself can dry out. If I was keeping scrub pythons in Florida, I'd probably never spray them. Just keep a fresh water bowl, and that ambient humidity will be great for them. Obviously, for me out here, I bet my humidity is 15% right now today outside. They get sprayed multiple times a week. They're on, bedding that will absorb that moisture. When I'm cleaning them, typically like I'll dump their water bowl out into their bedding to spike the humidity. You do that in Florida, you're getting mold, you're getting blisters. That's not going to be good. So primary thing, adjust to your climate. The way that I'm keeping them won't be the way that you keep them there, won't be the way that I kept them in Chicago, won't be the way someone keeps them in Northern California. But with that said, general parameters though, if you have a room where you're keeping reptiles on ambient temperature, great. For me, I like doing ambient as much as I can, especially for animals that aren't breeders. It's so much safer. You don't have to worry about all the heat tape, and it's less expensive. It's easier on the electric bill. You're not having to buy a bunch of expensive thermostats and stuff like that. 78 to 82 degrees, you're good. If you're in an apartment, let's say, and you have a cage in your living room, different story. You keep your thermostat at 73, for instance. Then in that enclosure, I'd probably want a hot spot reading around 86. That would create like a mid to upper 70s ambient on the cool side. If you're in a humid area, you could theoretically keep them in like a glass Exoterra style setup if you wanted to. PVC cages are always great as well. Obviously I got PVC cages behind me.
So you're not doing any supplemental heat. You're just doing ambient.
So for me in particular, I have a few different rooms where I do things a couple different ways. Where I am right now is on the second floor of my house. It's kind of in an open area that it's walled off with cages, but not temperature controlled. So everything in here has supplemental heat. I have a room where I have all my babies and stuff like that, and that's all ambient. And then the room where my adult scrubs are, it will go through phases. So like right now, it's starting to get really hot. Probably this week, I'm going to shut all the heat off in that room. And it'll be, it probably won't get below 79 until October. And running AC the whole time. But then in the winter, and obviously for breeding, everyone's getting supplemental heat. Females have their basking spots. And then, the room will drop into the low 70s, high 60s as part of like cycling them. Where like this space I'm in right now is going to stay pretty stagnant as far as temperature goes year round. Days during the summer are going to be hotter than days during the winter. So I have dialed back some of their heat a little bit, but still, I got to sleep at night. So I got to turn down the temperature a little bit. So I'm doing that. So for me, really, I'm keeping a few different ways in a few different rooms in my house.
Yeah.
Because none of the other rooms are going to be getting a 73-degree ambient temperature, but this room will. And like, if I just fed the night before, I need those snakes to have a little bit of supplemental heat, back up in the day when they're digesting. So like I said, I'll probably have them with an 85 to 86 degree hot spot.
So you just let that kind of rise up during the day and then it'll drop a little bit at night.
Yeah. And like the racks, I have a couple racks in here, some freedom breeders, and they'll be on all the time, but they're, that's small strip in the back where the snakes can have a pretty huge range of, when they burrow down the bedding a little bit, get right on top of it, they can probably get almost up to 90. But then if they go all the way to the front of the tub, they're probably 74, 73. So they always have that range there. But anyway, I guess back to the care requirements. So let's say you're in Florida, you can set them up a bunch of different ways, as long as you have a good ambient humidity in your room and keep those temperatures kind of around the parameters that I was laying out. They're hardy. They can take temperature swings, they can take humidity swings. They're not the most sensitive species in the world as far as that goes. Their sensitivity comes with their skin and with that, stagnant.
Are they really soft like a Timor?
Yeah.
I'm blown away by how soft
they feel like velvet. Yeah, very very soft, kind of delicate skin relative to some other pythons.
Sure. In your opinion, are they a display animal or are they something you can take out, like a pet, something you can take out, interact with, sit down with, play around with?
I would say some of the calmest snakes I've ever had have been scrub pythons. Like I would take out some of them that I've raised or the ones I produced and like hand them to a 2-year-old.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So they have a terrible, maybe not a terrible reputation, but they have a reputation,
they had a terrible reputation. There were a couple of people that were really, they like to emphasize how terrible these snakes were. And I think primarily because they worked with them and wanted to feel special. Like, look at me, I can tame the beast kind of thing. It's like, you're treating them like they're this Bushmaster, Black Mamba, King Cobra, super hybrid. Like,
yeah.
No, they're not. They're a python. They're a python like all other pythons are pythons. To me, you take like all the best aspects of a lot of the different pythons, put them all into one species, and you get these. But yeah, especially with captive bred ones, if you raise them from when they're young, like the animals that I was saying, like I would be comfortable handing these to small children. The ones I've had since they were babies. There's animals I've gotten as 3-4-year-old wild caughts that I can interact with. I might not hand them to a child because you never really know. But with these animals, I'm like, they're perfect. They're calmer than a lot of the ball pythons I've had. And I'm very intentional about doing that. I don't handle them all the time, but like once or twice a week when I'm cleaning them, I handle them. When they're babies, my strategy is I lift the hide and then I grab them from the top down like this. Because their typical response is going to be to like look up at you and rear back. That's their defensive response. So the way I see it, if you grab them from the top, that kind of desensitizes them to that response. And so then when you have a bigger animal that isn't going to have that kind of knee-jerk look up at you defensive reaction, it's just going to lend to that animal being that much calmer. And it's not just me. I know there's a lot of people that, especially with the captive bred scrubs, are just they're perfect snakes. They're very interactive. They move, but they don't really move that quickly. They like to grab onto you. They like to move upward. Like if I'm ever in an interaction with a scrub python, I can tell they're getting stressed out. I just like raise them over my head and get them fixated on like the top of a cage or something like that. And then they just want to go. They want to go up. They feel comfortable when they're higher up than whatever might be stressing them out. I have some that would like crawl up in my head and kind of like curl up, like, you know, and just sit there while I'm cleaning their enclosure. They really are, as far as like that goes, like an interactive, larger but not too large pet snake. I think they're the best option out there, especially captive bred ones.
Wow.
And that's part of why I, you know, got into them the way that I did. It was like, I think there's a massive void here in the hobby for a snake like this. And also, and not, this is just meant to be purely factual, not like I'm shitting on retics, but I already said what it is going to be. I think they're the best alternative to retics, because no matter what, you know, people love retics. I like retics. They could be banned tomorrow again, theoretically. Yeah. A lot of people don't understand how the Lacey Act legislation works. The Lacey Act is not just about the snakes. It's a sweeping bill. It's mostly related to plants, lots of aquatic life. It's just a commerce bill about injurious wildlife. The 5 python species were added to it, reticulated pythons included, which, you know, you can't import them, you can't transport them across state lines, yada, yada. They were not taken off the Lacey Act. The way the entire Lacey Act was interpreted for everything got changed. There are some industries that are pissed at us, especially like the horticultural industry, because there are injurious plants that probably need to be restricted. But for the sake of removing the snakes off of it, the entire interpretation of that piece of legislation got changed. Who's to say it can't go back? It's not gone. It's still there. It's just being enforced differently.
Sure.
We can't import these animals anymore, but we can move them across state lines. So I think there's just a big vulnerability. I know one of the things that is trying to be done to protect that on the retic side is to reclassify some of these dwarf locality types as a different species.
I'd love that. I would love to see the dwarf and super dwarves available in Florida. I don't think it's ever going to happen, but if they maybe could do something with subspecies or something to break them off a little bit further. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, I don't know. I haven't seen any of the research, but just based on the way that other species get split up, I would say it's probably likely. The right genetic work needs to be done. But you know, the same way that green tree pythons are all a bunch of different species now, the same can be applied to a lot of different reptiles from that region of the world. But with that said, that hasn't come through yet, and retics haven't been rebanned, so to speak, yet. But they are concerned. There's never been national level legislation about scrub pythons. There's there are a bunch of different little municipalities around the country that have a bunch of weird laws, like the whole thing with the Dallas Reptile Show. If you can't sell a python that's not a ball python there, because that's the law in Dallas. I'm like, wow, that's crazy.
That is crazy.
This is my state where I came here to keep venomous snakes. And there's one of the biggest cities, you can't even keep a carpet python. Oh, you can't even keep a children's python. Like, you know,
that's nuts.
Not even thinking about the bigger stuff. You can't keep an anthill python in Dallas because it's not a ball python. Talk about uninformed legislation, but that's another topic. So from a legality standpoint, I think there's the scrub pythons are in a much better place than reticulated pythons are. And I think it's mostly just like a lack of exposure on a larger scale. You know, most people in the US these days, you say the phrase Burmese python, they know what that is.
Yeah.
Same way ball python, probably most people in the country have heard of a ball python. The number 3 python is probably a reticulated python, because of, you know, people like Jay Brewer posting a bunch of crazy videos on the internet. And I guess I won't go down that rabbit hole, but you know, not good. But then, you know, who the hell knows what a scrub python is? Who the hell knows what a Papuan python is? You know, there's a lot of these animals that are just, there's not known in the public eye. And I think for that, That coupled with they haven't been found in the wild in the US, which is a plus. The only reason that there would be legislation levied against them if there was legislation levied against a lot of different shit all at once. The same thing that would affect ball pythons or whatever. So from a legality standpoint, I think they offer a good alternative for a big snake because they're not involved in any national level legislation.
Yeah, I think the reputation that I was exposed to was early in the 20 teens, maybe even going back to 2010, we'll say, was when I was first keeping. And I remember seeing them in a couple books and being just blown away. Wow, what is this snake? And my connections at the time were like, oh, you want a snake that'll get to be 18 feet long and bite your face off every time you go in to touch it, so that was sort of what then, you take a little comment like that and it's burned into your brain. Then every time you hear scrub python, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Right. Yeah. And I'm trying to do my best, and I know there are a lot of other people that are as well, showing how that's not the case. I mean, for one, there's a reason why on my Instagram page I have pictures of the snakes in my hands.
Yeah.
It's like there are hundreds and hundreds of pictures of scrub pythons in my left hand without puncture wounds all over me. That picture wouldn't be possible if that snake was as evil as everyone would like to think. So yeah, it's like I want my page is like a case study of why scrub pythons don't have this terrible attitude.
I love it. And I love that you're giving them that exposure. And then also when somebody like me is curious and interested, it's not, no, you're not ready. There's no way you could handle this much snake.
Yeah. Sean Childress, he's a keeper in the Chicago area. He kept scrub pythons when I was first getting into it. And I asked him, like, I don't know if I'm ready for these. And I was like, well, what do you have now? I'm like, oh, I keep like carpets and white lips, Timors, olives, stuff like that. He's like, oh, you already do it. Yeah. These are just pythons. Like, that's it. Like, they're just a different python that have some different personality traits, but like, there's not some giant difference between the rest of the pythons and scrub pythons. They're just another python.
Yeah.
You got to be ready for a snake that's going to get big. But like at that time for me, I already kept olive pythons. They're like the same size wise as scrub pythons and even a little bit heavier bodied. For me, I always make sure that anyone who I'm selling to, this is not their first python or whatever. But like if you were to reach out to me like, hey, I'm interested in scrub pythons. I have these Timor pythons from Ryan Young. To me, I'm like, okay, you take this seriously. You have similar snakes. You got them from basically the best source you can. So you've done your research. To me, I'm like, this is perfect. This is everything that I look for when someone is reaching out to me. If someone's like misspelled, poor grammar, text, and I go on their page and I don't see anything with reptiles or mutual friends or whatever, I'm like, are you sure? Yeah. Are you sure you don't want a ball python first?
They're like, but I got this 55-gallon aquarium.
Yeah.
Your scrub will fit in there perfectly.
Exactly. But I will say, though, I do think that there are scenarios where a scrub python could be your first snake. Not for everybody. I know people who have gotten a scrub python as their first snake, and it's gone great. I have one friend who she's actually bred scrub pythons, and I believe a scrub python was her first snake. So, it's not, you got to be ready. You got to know what's going on. You got to probably be a pretty intelligent person to begin with and, have a lot of your research done. But with how captive bred scrub pythons are becoming more prominent, I don't think that that's an impossibility. Certainly not for everybody. But the same way that some people get a retake for their first snake, 20 years ago, if someone said, if you were to say to somebody that, oh, I want to reticulate a python as my first snake, they'd be like, are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
What are you thinking? This snake's going to get 20 feet long and it's aggressive and it's yada, yada, yada. But now I want a albino golden child, 75% calato, something. It'll get like 7 feet long and it's however many generations captive bred on the morph side and it's all nice and calm and like, sure, I understand that. Yeah. With the right guidance, that could definitely be someone's first snake. So I think scrub pythons theoretically could be seen the same way, like I said, under the right circumstances.
Nice. So just real clearly defined, what are your temperature guidelines for let's say you have sort of a sub-adult, maybe an adult, let's just say, we're a couple of years in the future and we have that F1 Halmahera
Yeah.
and it's ready to go from the bin into a 4x2x2 or something similar. What
Yeah.
kind of temperatures are you looking for that? Considering it's just in a house with AC running, so not on ambient.
Sure. Yeah. So I would probably shoot for that like a hot spot around like 85, 86, where on the cool side, you're probably hitting the upper 70s. Pretty straightforward like that, to try to keep the mean temperature in the lower 80s or around 80 degrees. They don't need to be particularly hot. The only time a scrub python ever really needs to be hot is a gravid female basking, or a female developing follicles basking. And that's really about it. And like I said, they can take swings, especially at really solid established animals. But if you're keeping one in your living room or your bedroom or whatever, shoot for like an 86 degree hotspot, cool side ambient in the upper 70s, average cage temperature around 80 degrees.
Sounds good. Now, what happens if it gets warmer? What happens if it goes up to 90 for 2 or 3 hours out of the day and the cool side is still 78, 80?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're just going to keep on scrubbing.
They might just go to the cool side, or they might enjoy that higher basking temperature for a shorter period of time.
Yeah. Okay.
They're not dumb snakes, that's for sure. There are dumb snakes out there, like green tree pythons. Green tree pythons are beautiful and absolutely stupid.
I'm going to clip that.
Please do, by all means. I'll say it again. But scrub pythons they're not that way. They'll move if they need to. They're not drowning in an inch of water.
I've noticed that with my Timors. The female, after she eats, she goes out and she'll take all that basking temperature she can get. And that might vary from 86 to 89. It'll kind of go up and then it'll start to go down. And I just love seeing that. I love seeing activity where you actually see them utilize different things in their space.
Exactly.
So what is it about green tree pythons? Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I'm curious.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I love green tree pythons. I only have one green tree python right now. I've worked with many over the years. I've bred them multiple times. But I think anyone who keeps green tree pythons will tell you they just do unintelligent things sometimes. They have like crazy feeding responses, which is a good thing. But I've had to stop green tree pythons from like eating paper towels and stuff like that. And I at one time had to pull a pair apart from each other. I probably should have just separated them before feeding to begin with. But there's just not a lot going on upstairs with them, and that's what it is. Not like a bad thing necessarily, but they're kind of like the dumb blonde stereotype of snakes.
Very pretty.
Yes, but yeah, I mean, there definitely are levels to snake intelligence, and obviously once you kind of start comparing it to like lizards or even like crocodilians, they're very low intelligence animals. But there's a range. With pythons, you have like scrub pythons, retics, and pop one pythons at the top end of the range, and down at the bottom end of the range. I think that's where green tree pythons fall.
Yeah. So how do you verify your temps? Just a temp gun?
Temp gun, I have a good amount of like the sensor push temperature sensors around my house. I'm always checking that. The Herpstat 4s will show you not only what you have it set to, but then the actual reading at the probe site. So that's helpful as well, just walking by. But I mostly go just based off of those ambient room temperatures. And then, when I'm cleaning, I'll touch the heat panel or make sure everything's good. They'll unplug shit. They'll push probes around. The snakes will be snakes. I'm actually staring at a snake that unplugged its heat panel right now. So I got to go. But yeah, for me, I mostly focus on the ambient, and especially with snakes that aren't breeding. And especially now that it's summertime, the ambient temperature is really what I'm shooting for. And then supplemental heat at that point, if the ambient temperature is good, sometimes isn't even necessary. So
cycling temps as if you were going to breed. Do you recommend that for just somebody that's just keeping one animal?
You don't need to. You don't really need to necessarily. I would say if anything, for someone who's just keeping one animal for like long-term health, giving that animal a couple of breaks a year from food would probably be more beneficial than anything else.
Why?
In the wild, they just kind of naturally will. Even some of these tropical species, they don't experience much of a temperature difference. they'll experience like dry seasons. And then any species that relies even moderately on bird migration will have kind of gorge periods where, the migratory birds are there. They eat as many of them as they can. The birds leave, and now they have less prey for however long. But then in captivity, though, it does seem that the animals that have true longevity, once they reach adult size, and that's a very important caveat, once they reach adult size, are fed moderately, those are the ones that really do well. If they're fed moderately when they're young, those animals subsequently don't do quite as well as adults.
Can you define that? Like give some parameters on moderate and
so for me with my pythons, until they're at least 2 years old, they get a weekly meal no matter what. And because I've gotten animals from other collections that were, they were pretty strict on a light feeding schedule, and I would consider some of those animals stunted. Even, I've acquired scrub pythons that were like 2 years old, captive bred, that were the size of neonates. I put them on my feeding schedule, and they still haven't caught up 4 years later to where I think they should be size wise. I think that nutrition at a young age is vitally important for their longevity. But with that said, you gotta slow them down at a certain point, because that's probably in like around 3 years old, 3 to 4 years old, depending on the species. They're going to use those calories to grow when they're small. That's where they're going to go. But eventually, once their body is more developed, their musculature more defined, the excess will become fat stores. And that is obviously super detrimental to these animals. So I would say most complications of captive snakes in particular come from overfeeding, but come from overfeeding overfeeding meaning feeding them too much once they are older. I have some adult scrub pythons that might see 10 meals a year and maybe not even that.
Wow.
If I were to feed a 3-year-old that way, it would never grow, and it would be unhealthy. It would, develop problems at a young age, die early. So, feeding is very dependent on the stage of life. But like, for instance, my ball pythons that I still have that, they're all over 10 years old, I maybe feed them once a month, and sometimes maybe I'm like, oh, I haven't fed them for 6 weeks. I'll feed them. And they are always ready for food at that point. A lot of adult ball pythons, they're notorious for going off of food. And I wonder if that's just because they're overfed to begin with, and they have very, very healthy body structure. They're not skinny by any means. They look like ball pythons, but they're always ready for food because they're not getting fed weekly. And honestly, a lot of the times when they are being fed weekly at some of these bigger facilities, it's because they want an extra egg out of that next clutch. And then that snake dies when it's 11 years old.
Yeah.
That snake should live until it's 50 to 60. And I understand the purpose of commercial breeding. I commercially bred rodents. I'm not on my high horse here. But for me, where I'm at with my animals, that longevity is a focus of mine. And, I'd rather my snake live an extra 10 years than get an extra 10 eggs from it over however long.
Sure.
And I probably will with the species that I'm working with, because the ball pythons, they're naturally built to maintain a higher amount of body fat. Scrub pythons, not so much. So a fat ball python could be a better breeder year over year, as far as this one weighs an extra 500 grams. I'm getting 2 extra eggs from it. Scrub python, not so much.
Yeah.
That extra weight will be detrimental to breeding. So again, very much a case by case type of thing, which is why you can't approach feeding every species the same way across the board.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's the biggest thing I've noticed since I came back to the hobby is the individualized care for every species, between temperatures, feeding, everything. Everything is it's so much different than the way I left the hobby.
And there are a lot of similarities. Like, most pythons can be kept in a way that's like 90% similar to the next one. But then there's that last 10% where you kind of have to adjust little things from species to species, whether it's temperatures or cycling for breeding, how you feed them, when you feed them, prey size, prey frequency, these little things that make a big difference, but are very minute when you compare to the overall picture of, you can keep every python, maybe with the exception of Boland's pythons and carpet pythons, within about the same parameters. But then for it to be absolutely perfect, that's where you got to tweak that last 5 to 10%.
if you do plan on breeding, let's say you have a pair of Halmaheras, at what age are you going to start cycling the temperatures?
I might do that by about 4 years old, even if they're not even close to breeding, just so that they're accustomed to that cycle. And it's like a natural annual thing for them. I would say typically across the board with scrub pythons, sexual maturity is about 6 years old. Some can breed younger, but most don't. I've had 5-year-old females lay clutches for me, but far more that have not than have. And some might need to be 7 or 8 years old. So there's a lot of individual variation within these snakes as well. And I'll give a big caveat saying this is also with wild caught animals. Captive bred will likely end up falling into a more regimented cycle just because they are captive. There's not that adjustment period of wild to captivity with those snakes. This is their life. So same way it worked with retics, ball pythons, New Caledonian geckos, monitor lizards. The captive bred ones they're more tuned into this system because this is what they do. Yeah. But I would say, like if I raise a captive bred pair of Halmaheras, I think size is important too for breeding. I just think sometimes smaller animals just won't breed, females in particular. But let's say that my female is like 7 feet long. Like, okay, she's probably of that size where she could lay. I would cycle her the same way that I would cycle anything else. Once it starts getting cooler, wherever you are, temperatures start to drop, eliminate food for a little while and then bring it back up in a couple of months, reintroduce food, give them a couple of really big meals. That always seems with a lot of pythons. Out of cooling down, a couple big meals in succession seem to really trigger them to go through that process. I like to pair during the cool down. Not everyone does this. For instance, like retic breeders won't put their retics together until the female's off of food. Scrub pythons, some of them won't even refuse food before ovulating. I found that they'll refuse food with about a week or a week and a half before ovulation. So if you waited until she stopped eating, well, if she wasn't paired up before then, she probably wouldn't have stopped eating to begin with. She would have just reabsorbed her follicles and moved on like normal. But I've always been a believer that pairing spurs follicular development. So the female might not have follicles. There's some environmental stimulus that are, priming her for that process. But now the male's around, maybe even a copulation, having that presence of that male, having that mating event could be what triggers her to start producing her follicles.
Okay.
Even though that lock might come 5-6 months before eggs, I believe that has something to do with the process starting for that female.
Interesting.
It's worked out for me so far. Where I also believe that I've paired some females up late to where they were already developing on their own. The breeding didn't begin early enough, and I've gotten like slug clutches because of it.
So you're taking them off food, cooling them down, and then pairing. And then you're bringing the temperatures back up, introducing food again, bringing food back into it, larger meals.
Yep.
And you're separating them, or are they staying together that whole time?
Obviously I'll separate them for feeding, but I like to keep them together as much as possible. For me, I'm still figuring out how to do all this. So I like to work on 1-to-1 ratios as much as possible. I know I've missed clutches because I had a male that was with another female, still getting the job done, but I needed this female bred too. But then I've also successfully done that once or twice too. But with that said, I'd much rather just have that extra male and be able to keep all my females covered than to risk missing a clutch because I just didn't have an available male ready to go.
Are you manipulating the males in any way by taking like a shed skin and putting it in another cage to kind of...
I did that with the scrubs for the first time this year, actually a little bit inadvertently. I had one pair that it was a female that I bred in 2022. I wanted to take a different male to her. And they weren't doing anything. This was a male that I've raised from almost a baby. It was my second scrub python I got. And I've had him with a number of females and I've never seen him copulate. I put the male in with the female that bred her the first time, who I was like, he's a stud. He'll breed anything. And he did lock her up, but he also shed in the enclosure. I didn't plan on this. So after he shed, I was like, I'm just going to keep this in here. So I took him out, put him with another female, the one I really wanted him to go to, took that original male, put him with that girl with his old shed in there. And like the next day they locked up.
No kidding.
pretty sure he's the one who got her. So
Are you gonna use that, or is that a lever you're gonna pull from now on?
if I need to, I have some really, really good breeder males that are just, they don't give a fuck. They're getting the job done. So if I need to, absolutely. But if it doesn't seem necessary, and if it's like some of my males that I'm like, these are just like the rock stars of the collection, I don't even really need to think about it because I know that they're gonna get it done.
Nice. So do you use just radiant heat panels, or are you using, what else are you using? Are you using heat bulbs, anything like that?
I mean, for better or worse, I am just using radiant heat panels. I think if I was to redesign it all today, I probably use bulbs, but I already have all these heat panels, so I'm using these heat panels. But I do prefer the smaller heat panels. I think the bigger ones can just kind of flood out a little bit too much heat and not create a concentrated spot, because it seems to me that they'll very intentionally bask in concentrated heat at certain areas of their body where they'll warm up and it'll kind of spread throughout their follicles, but they don't necessarily need the direct heat on the entirety of their follicle mass or their egg mass. I've had clutches go bad where like these females had big heat panels, and then like my best clutches have been from females that had smaller heat panels, and then like, for instance, like Ryan Young uses exclusively heat bulbs, and no one else right now is doing the whole python breeding thing better than him. So,
And he just has them on timers, right?
I believe so.
They just come on, heat up, and then turn off.
Yeah.
That's incredible. When I heard that,
don't fix it.
Yeah, when I heard that on your podcast, I'm like, man, that's a hell of a method. Keep it simple.
Yep. Exactly. So, and like I have like LED lights in my cages as well, but other than that, what I will do is one thing that I do that a lot of people don't, and I'm not sure why. I keep my nest boxes in with my females year round. A lot of python breeders, particularly like green tree python breeders, carpet python breeders, will have issues of females not laying in their nest box. I have never had a scrub python not lay in their nest box, and I think it's because they're so accustomed to that space that they have it, because it doubles as their hide as well. It's in there year round. It's underneath, so that it's like a panel, basking shelf, nest box, with then the panel of the cage that's below it right underneath. So there's a little bit of heat radiating into that box, where it's a bit warmer than the rest of the enclosure, which I think is useful as well.
Have you done maternal at all, or is that all you do?
No, I haven't. I don't think I could do it here with how dry it is.
Yeah. What are you putting in the nest box?
Sphagnum moss.
Okay.
And I think I would need to, like, I have a friend, Paul Duran, he has a clutch of Southerns on the ground right now. He's doing maternal incubation, but he concocted this like very elaborate nest box setup to where it would, maintain moisture and maintain the humidity, not get too bogged down for the eggs. Like, he went all out on his maternal incubation. I'm not going to do that. I have too many of these snakes, and so more credit to people like him who will. If I'm ever in an area that's more humid, I might try it. I'd love to. That would be such a rewarding thing to just open that nest box one day and to see a bunch of babies sitting in the mom's coils. So it's definitely a goal of mine. But I also, since I'm doing this as a profession, those eggs are very important for paying the bills around here as well. And I just feel comfortable most of the time, being more in control of that incubation.
What are the benefits and drawbacks of maternal incubation, in your opinion?
I mean, I don't know. I think the benefit would be it's probably a lot more fun than artificial incubation. And I could only imagine. I mean, so like I know kind of because of some of the vipers that I've bred, because they give live birth, and like some like abronia lizards and stuff like that I've bred in the past. Opening that or walking into your room and just seeing a cage full of babies when the night before you didn't. It's hard to beat that. That feeling doesn't come from opening an egg box. But then the benefit of, obviously, like particularly with scrub pythons, of taking those eggs away. One, they have a very long incubation. It's about 90 days. So there's a lot that can go wrong. Ball pythons or green trees are in that 50 range. A lot less time for something to go wrong. You can get that female back on food a lot quicker. Some will lose a lot of weight and you'll be like, oh my God, you got fucking drained. And then some others like will lay their eggs and look like they did before breeding season. But so I just like to get them back onto food. But I have nothing against maternal incubation. I think it's probably cooler if you can. Paul actually got his female has been eating with her eggs. Like she'll like come out and bask, eat, and like go back to her eggs.
Wow, that's so cool.
So like that would be such a cool process to observe firsthand, like how this female's natural rhythm is, because obviously they know what they're doing. I think you just need to give them the right parameters, and I know that the way that I do it, it's good for what I'm doing, but for maternal it would not be good.
Yeah, right on. So just in general, just for keeping, what is a good humidity if you're tracking that with a hygrometer? What's a number you'd want to see for a scrub?
I would say like generally probably like in the 50 to 65 range, but then especially if you're in a drier area, a couple of sprays a week to spike the humidity and whatnot, you'll be good. But yeah, having good high quality water available for them, I think, is more important than like spraying. But ambient humidity is important too.
It's interesting. A lot of people think that since I'm in Florida, my house is humid as hell. But since the AC is running 24/7, I'm sitting right around 45, 50%.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Which was kind of a shock to me during the day when the AC doesn't run as much because we set it higher. So it's not running all the time.
Yeah.
It's maybe 55 to 60, right? But then once the AC kicks on, it like at night when we're sleeping, it's down at usually 47, 48. Yeah. So my substrate, my coconut chip, which is what I use in most of my cages, it dries out surprisingly fast. And so I'll go in and usually mist, I don't know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, let's say, maybe 2 or 3 times a week.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is surprising. I think it's just because that AC is cranking all the time and dehumidifying,
Sure. Yeah.
So how are you keeping the humidity up? Just through substrate, water bowl, misting?
In my adult room, I run a couple humidifiers as well. If I didn't, it would be 10% humidity in there.
Okay.
So.
And that's keeping you right in that kind of 50, 60.
Yeah. At night when it cools off and it has, the humidity has an opportunity to build a bit more. When I come in the morning, sometimes it's like in the upper 60s, but then by 6, 7 p.m., it's probably down to like 40 to 45.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like to, for that room, I like to keep it above 40 if I can.
How often do you change your water?
I mean, I do it probably once a week. Usually, I'll do a intermittent change if it needs it. If someone spilled or shit in their water, or if a water bowl got a bunch of substrate in it or something like that. But yeah.
How are you sanitizing your bowls?
I use one of a few cleaners that I have, and then it's like soap and a sponge, wash them. But then for my adults, otherwise I use disposable deli cups.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So all the Neos are on deli cups. You just take them out and put a new one in.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, everything that's not like an adult scrub python has, even some of the bigger snakes in here have deli cups still. So just, I've done it for a long time. It's fast and efficient. And if I didn't, I would probably be adding another 15 hours onto my work week.
Jeez. Yeah. I can't imagine with that many animals.
Yeah.
Do you recommend giving a bowl large enough to soak in?
I don't think it's necessary with them. Yeah. In my experience with scrub pythons, hasn't been everybody's who I've talked to, but if they're soaking, they have mites. And if they don't have mites, they're not soaking. People have told me that they have scrubs that'll soak and they don't have mites. I'm like, okay, I might not believe you, but with that said, I've never had one soak for no reason. So
that's a huge plus in my opinion. Because when if somebody says, yeah, you should really give a bowl that they can soak in, it's like, geez Louise. For an 8-foot snake, that's a big ass water bowl.
Yeah, I mean, the only way you would really be able to do that efficiently is if you had a plumbed water tub in an enclosure or something like that. Because otherwise, it's prohibitive for time and efficiency and whatnot.
Do you recommend UVB?
Neutral. I've done it. I've seen no benefit with my snakes. I mean, I can't imagine it would hurt them unless you're using a bulb that's way too high output, or like some of the LED UVBs have been led to like corneal injuries and stuff like that if you set them up the wrong way or let them get too close to it or something like that. I don't know. The way that I see it, I think the potential risks of doing it wrong outweigh the benefits for snakes. There's some lizard species that definitely need UV Monitor lizards 100% do not need UVB.
Really?
Look at the history of monitor keeping and breeding. None of them, no breeder has ever used UV on like a big scale. I mean, I won't name names because I don't want to call them out, but I've had a couple of the most respected monitor breeders in the world tell me UV is a scam, kind of tongue in cheek. Not that that's their full true opinion, but they've produced hundreds to thousands of monitor lizards and have had lizards live for decades and decades and, have never had an issue that you can be like, well, that thing really needed UV, didn't it? But I think that comes down to anything that eats full prey probably doesn't need it. I think proper diet and high quality prey is far more important than any sort of lighting.
And what do you think about, maybe supplementing with D3, talking about lizards right now, getting
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So like, for instance, when I was involved with the project of Abronia lizards, they had UV lighting and, supplement with calcium, with D3, without D3, multivitamin, carotenoids, bee pollen, all the stuff. So for some animals, it's 100% necessary. But then again, they're eating insect diets. I think anything that's eating rodent diets of any like matured rodent that eats on its own, so like a small mouse and bigger, and then like a weaned rat and bigger, if you have issues related to calcium deficiency, then you have bad feeders. It's not that you need, might lighting help in an instance like that, but you probably don't want to be feeding your animals crap to begin with, which would cause any problems like that. So I don't know. I've never seen evidence that I think is compelling that snakes need UV lighting.
I use the 6% UV bulbs from Arcadia, just the fluorescence, because I feel safer using the fluorescence. I don't feel like there's been enough data on the LEDs yet.
Sure.
So I got it in there, it's on a timer.
Yeah. The only thing that, and you can even see in the back of some of my enclosures up top, I have some of those. They're just not on anymore.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how damn hot they get.
It is crazy. Yeah. You almost don't, I almost don't need heat.
Oh no, I for a long time I had enclosures that I didn't run the heat panel and I just had that light on. But like there were some cages that even the smallest version in, when that light was on, it was 90 to 98 degrees in that cage.
Wow.
Without a spot that they could escape from it. I'm like,
wow.
well, I can't do this.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah.
So you don't always think of that, but the like T5 UVB strip lights, they emit a crap ton of heat.
Yeah, I use, the deep heat emitters.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, I have them almost off.
Yeah.
It's purely supplemental. It gives a tiny little bit extra overnight, so the basking spots and, 80 degrees at night or something like that, because I have the AC running. But yeah, they get surprisingly hot. Yeah.
So that I mean, anything of like lack of data or whatever aside, just from maintaining the proper thermal gradient, that's one of the reasons why I don't use them.
Yeah. Now you use the LED lights, so obviously you see value in the day-night cycle.
Yeah, and it's a lot of it's for me too. The room's getting light in the day, so like they're experiencing light, but really it's just because I like to look at them and it's easy to observe things. And when I'm feeding, it's nice to like know where that snake is that's shooting out at you. But no, I would say that the LEDs they're mostly for me.
What you brought up them shooting out, how's their feed response? Are they pretty hard to get started? Do they take to rodents pretty quick?
They can be difficult. They're not the easiest. They're not the hardest. So like, for instance, with the clutch that I just hatched out, three of the babies have eaten after 2 attempts, which is like good for what I've seen. If they absorb all of their yolk, they can maintain themselves for a long time without needing a meal, like 3 to 4 months without starting to lose weight. But I'm quick to force feed if I need to, because I feel like if you wait too long, their body gets so withered that they don't have the capacity to actually metabolize that meal properly if their system's been just like shut down for a while. Yeah. So if they're not eating, and it's pretty clear they're not eating, like they're not even showing interest, I'll intervene earlier And then it just a point comes. I don't assist feed. I don't do the lodge it in the back of their mouth and sit there. I shove it down. The way that I see it, no matter what, that's a stressful experience for that snake. So let's be in and out as fast as we can. The goal is to get that meal into a snake that doesn't want to take it. And if I'm going to play God in that way, let's just get it over with. And I have a few now that I had to force feed they're perfect. They just have some catch up to do as far as growth goes. But just one day you'll open that tub and it'll turn its head and it'll flick its tongue and I'm like, oh, you're ready now. Give it a heat up a little fuzzy mouse and boom, grabs it.
Yeah. So you're doing mice. Do you ever do quail or anything like chickens?
I do quail as a last resort with baby scrub pythons. I don't like feeding them birds. I know people who do and people who do it successfully. I don't personally like it. I think that, I've experienced they don't grow in a way that I think is ideal with a bird diet. Like for instance, baby scrubs, I fed day-old quail side by side with the ones that are eating equivalent sized mice or African soft furs. Give them a few months. The one eating rodents will be twice the size of the one eating the birds, and the one eating the birds is hardly even grown. Though, so to me, if I need to, I'll resort to quail before I resort to force feeding. But once they're eating the quail, the goal is to get them off of that quail as soon as possible.
Does that create a whole nother problem then? Yeah,
it definitely does. But it's not as bad of a problem as the snake not eating at all. It's the way that I look at it. And eventually, for a while with the quail, I'll need to heat them up real hot, tease feed them a little bit. Eventually, they're flying and grabbing that quail before they even can recognize what it is. That's usually the point where they'll take the rodent, where they're like, they'll eat anything now because they're not even waiting to see what it is before they take it. They smell foods in the room. They know stuff's getting fed and they're ready to go.
So you're not selling any animals that aren't ready to go, right? When you sell them, they're eating.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. I'll sell. I have sold some, like Kenneth, he got some Highlands for me. And I was like, hey, they're eating quail. They will, and they have since transitioned on to mice. But you might need to give them a few quail meals before they'll start eating mice. And so like I'll sell them that they're eating quail, but if not, non-feeding, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And obviously, if something were to happen to those snakes that I'd sold them, I'd take care of it. I'm not leaving you high and dry with snakes that, in hindsight, weren't ready to go. So
yeah. For an adult animal, so we're going to start them off in a tub, right? Just less stress, more safety for the animal.
Yeah, for me more, it's really just the ability to observe them. My friend Alexandra, who produces the Barneck Maruki crosses, she starts her babies in a planted 4x2x2 all cohab together.
Wow.
And they do great. So it works. I think one of the things that benefits her is that she has a much smaller collection than I do. But it just goes to show there isn't one answer to this question. Yeah. I start my babies in 6-quart tubs on paper towel. She puts hers in a planted 4x2x2 all together. And they both work. Obviously, with them being captive bred, produced at her house, in her enclosures at her house, that's probably why she's so successful. If you were to take a clutch of wild caught babies or, ones that were plucked out of a nest and did that with them, you might not have as good of results. But then again, I've done neither, so I don't really know. But yeah, just 6-quart tub, water bowl, hide. Sometimes I'll use PVC 3D printed perches for them if I have some that are not in use, and just keep them in there until they're like eating routinely. And then if I have available tubs to upgrade them, then I will. They're big when they hatch. They're long. They're deceptively long. They can coil up into this little tiny coil, but they're like 18 inches long.
Wow.
So there have been times where I'm like, I'll go through everybody. The way they're sitting in the tub, I'm like, okay, that's good. And then I take the snake out. I'm like, oh wow, you need an upgrade. This is not fair to you. So then I'll throw them in a bigger tub. But that little 6-quart tub, it's good because if I'm feeding them live prey, the prey can never be too far from them at any point in time.
What are the dimensions of a 6-quart tub?
Oh, like maybe 10, 11 inches by 5 by 3.5. Something like that. Like the standard, like baby ball python tub.
Sure.
So yeah, typically I'll have them in there for, I would say average 6 months, and then upgrade them to the 15-quart tub, which is just kind of like double the volume of the 6-quart tub. And move up until, if I, the ones that I hold back, into the point where they go into like the 2x2x2 cages, and then continue to upgrade them as I have space and availability until they're in their adult cages.
So what would be a forever home for a Halmahara?
I mean, like, I have my biggest adults right now in 4x2x2s. As they grow, I might put them in some 5x2x2s or something like that I have. But most of them, I think, would do just fine in a 4x2x2 long term. You can go bigger though. That's the thing with these snakes. Once they're adults and they're solid, you can build giant enclosures for them. They're, as long as you can find them and feed them, they're fine. But I'm kind of working on a semi-commercial type scale, so I have to make some concessions just for the sake of having the number of animals I do.
Sure. Yeah. And we appreciate your efforts.
Thank
They're
you.
much needed. So getting back to the feeding, we've already touched a lot on the feeding, but so 1 to 2 or 0 to 2 years old, you're doing weekly feeding. And
Yep.
then from there, you're pushing it out to every 2 weeks from
Typically,
2 on.
Yeah. Usually until they're around the size where they can eat a large rat. Like they're, from like when they're born until they can eat a small rat weekly, from the time they can eat a small rat until the time they can eat a large rat every other week. And then by the time they're on those large rats, usually like every 3 to 4 weeks, I push it out to.
Okay. And what are some potential health problems? I know you mentioned the skin blisters, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So as far as like non-viral problems, I would say, their skin is probably the most sensitive part about them. They can get RIs the same way any other snake can get an RI if they're cold and dry, cold and damp and yada, yada, yada. But I've experienced very, very few respiratory infections in scrub pythons, luckily. So that's typically not something I'm super concerned about.
Is that usually what brings it on, being cold and damp?
Yeah.
If you do see one?
For an extended period of time. Yeah, absolutely.
How cold is cold?
It really depends on how damp. I would say, like, if they're, in the low 70s or below and damp for like multiple days at a time and they get an RI, wouldn't be shocked. With no supplemental heat.
Okay. So blisters if they're too wet, and an RI if they're too cold and wet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it seems like they don't like to be too wet.
Yes. It's that balancing that humidity and hydration without dampness. That's kind of the name of the game with them.
How do they do with handling? How, like, can they be handled too much? Does it stress them out, in your opinion? Or once they're kind of there and confident, are they just kind of good to go?
I mean, I think you can say that for any snake. You can, you pull that snake out every day, yeah, probably is going to be stressed out. But, I handle most of my snakes weekly and they're fine with it. There's nothing that I would say indicates any sort of level of stress with most of them. Some of like the wild caught animals that I got when they were bigger, they're never going to like it, but unfortunately they kind of have to come out for me to clean them. But ones that are tolerant of it, I mean, theoretically you could, handle that snake multiple times a week. Like if it was at like a place like the Reptarium, where this is an educational center where kids are coming in, they're interacting with animals. I think a captive bred scrub python would do just fine in a scenario like that, but it has to be the right animal that is tolerant and whatnot of that type of interaction, which a lot of them are, but certain ones aren't. And if you have one that isn't, then you got to adjust that accordingly. Right on.
All right. Well, I think that kind of wraps up the care guide. Anything else you want to add to it? Or I think we covered everything. Feeding,
honestly, it's straightforward. They're hardy snakes. I definitely want to emphasize that, if you're a degree or two off or 10% off on humidity or, okay, this is like general parameters. And if you can hit somewhere within these numbers, you're probably going to be fine. A lot of historically what was seen as like proper or improper husbandry, like if you are outside of these parameters, this is what's going to happen, is because those were pythons that had nidovirus, where if you didn't have those parameters right, they're going to develop their RIs from the virus will be able to build in their system. It won't be able to suppress it. And now that's when they get the respiratory infections. So I guess this is the care parameter for a non-nidovirus python. That's a different story, because all of these snakes are super hardy when they don't have a taxed immune system.
Right on. So it seems like it'd be better off if you had to go in one direction or the other. It'd be better off that they're too dry than too wet, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, too dry, they're going to have maybe a bad shed.
Yeah, you're going to supplement with some soaks or whatever.
Yeah. What do you think about soaking? Do you soak ever, or is it just if it's needed?
No, if when it's needed. If I have a bad shed is really the only time I'll soak, or like I've soaked some of my gravid females just to try to get them a little extra hydration with how dry it is out here. But like back in the Midwest, I never did that. Yeah, so really as needed basis.
Okay. Do you recommend somebody soak an animal after getting it in the mail, after it goes through FedEx and everything, to hydrate?
I don't see a problem with it. I haven't really done that historically.
Okay.
If it looks super dry, if it has a bad shed, if it seems dehydrated, I mean, but think about it. 16 hours. If you 16 hours in a box, 16 hours without a water bowl in a cage. Obviously, that's different. It's being shipped, but like that's not a long period of time. It wasn't exported to a different country. But then again, definitely can't hurt.
Okay.
I know people swear by it, and I haven't always done it, and I think both work depending on how the animal is doing.
Yeah, I pretty much don't soak unless I feel like it's needed, you know. So if there's some shed left behind or something like that, or if they look kind of dried out, I don't really see the point.